fourth edition of the LFA Spectator Podcast. I'm your host, Rohan Maglani, joined by James Coons and Nick Aludo. On this edition of the podcast, we are joined by Mr. De Jesus, head of school at Lake Forest Academy. Please enjoy.
Welcome, Mr. De Jesus. Thanks for joining us today.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So we wanted to start off with this question. What made you decide to get into the education field? And have you always had the goal of becoming a head of school when getting into the field?
Well, it's interesting. My mom is an educator, and she always told me very early on that education is a calling because she wasn't paid very much. She worked very hard, but she always loved what she did. But she looked at me and basically said, which reminds me, I have to call her. She just called me earlier today. So thanks for this reminder with this question. But she always said, this is a calling. And I did not immediately feel that calling. I was at Wesleyan University majoring in history. And I knew I did not want to live back at home. We have a small apartment in New York City. So I was like, okay, where can I, and my dream was to become a lawyer, actually, and to make a whole lot of money. That was the dream. So basically my goal was I'm going to spend like 2-3 years teaching history, and I got a great job at a place called Concord Academy in Concord, Massachusetts, half boarding, half day like LFA. And I started teaching, and on my second day, I did this special lesson for U.S. history. It was about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And I don't know if you remember from history, but there's a big question as to who fired the first shot. And here I am, 22 years old, 4 or 5 years older than the students in my class. As a matter of fact, I was just on the phone last week with one of the students who's in my class, became my advisee, and is turning 40, which is crazy. But basically, I did a lesson, and the students didn't understand. They were like, "What do you mean? How can they not know who started the fight?" So I pulled aside Ethan Bear, who is currently actually a rabbi in California. We're Facebook friends. And I said, "Hey, Ethan, here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna come into class, and we're going to essentially get into a fight, a physical, not a physical altercation, but a verbal altercation, and just play along with me." He said, "Okay." And I was lucky. Ethan, even though I was new to the school, Ethan was a theater guy. I didn't know that then. So I'm teaching class. Ethan comes in 10 minutes late, and I start getting at him, and he starts getting at me, and I get at him. He gets at me, and then it's like a whole battle. He's like, here at Concord Academy, we don't treat people that way, And I'm like, what? Where I come from, people respect their elders, and it's like a battle. So I kick him out. I go, you gotta go see the dean. Go. And he's like, he leaves. He goes, okay, I'm leaving. And he leaves. And I had 16 students in front of me. And I'm like, look, I'm brand new. Like my head's like this. I'm like, just like my head's in my hands, and I'm like about to cry. And I'm like, look, I'm brand new here. Can y'all just pick up paper, just write down what you saw. Like just write down what you saw. Because no one's gonna believe me. I don't think I'm new, and I don't know if they're gonna believe him. And be honest, be truthful. I just need your help. So everyone was like, writing, everything. So at the end, I said, okay, everybody, please put their pens down. I said, I'll be right back. I go outside. Ethan's waiting for me outside. We come in, we give each other a high five. He sits down. All the kids are like this. I like freaking out. And I can't believe it. Second day of my teaching. I'm 22 years old. And I said, okay, without changing your opinion, how many of you think I started the fight? And half of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you think Ethan started the fight? Half of them raised their hand. So I said, you just saw this 10 minutes ago, and you can't agree on the narrative? I was like, why would we expect a narrative from 1775 to hold true? And it was like saucers, their eyes. They were so big, and it was just that kind of energy you get in class. I don't know, hopefully you've all had that experience with a teacher in a class where something just pops. I have not looked back since. That was my second day of teaching, and I basically decided that day that I was going to teach for the rest of my career. And then I became an administrator little by little, and I was invited to be a dean, a grade dean, which basically meant just taking care of the 9th grade. And I was a paternity leave replacement. I hadn't thought about administration. I used to not like administrators when I was younger. I gave them a hard time. And I wasn't nasty, but I was like, I was a teacher, and I felt like I was a teacher first and foremost. And then they invited me to be a dean, and I said okay, and I did it for a semester. I thought it was only going to be for a semester. That became a year, became 6 years. And then I started doing administration, and what I learned was I love the work. I love working with students, particularly. I really love opportunity to be a harbor in the tempest. Like when things are rough, I really value being able to be a calming influence and encouraging influence, but also challenging people. I also believe in that too, that have someone to feel safe enough with me that I can challenge them and care for them. And that's how you show that care. And little by little, I started realizing, well, maybe headship would be an interesting thing. There are not a lot of younger heads out there, and there are not a lot of Latino heads out there. So I realized that I was not a typical profile, particularly coming to school in Illinois, coming from New York City. And then I just fell in love with LFA. And I felt, from day one, really, from my first interview, I remember thinking, oh my God, I hope I get this job. And the rest, as they say, is history. But it all developed from teaching. It all developed from that lesson, which to this day is one of the highlights of my life, not to mention my career. And each step of the way, I've enjoyed the impact I can have on the life of students. And each step of the way, I've generally been able to keep connected to students. And that's why I was sharing with you earlier before we started this interview, how I missed teaching and advising this year so much. And I did it to help support our work around COVID, but I need to get back to it as soon as possible.
And one thing, even though you are a teacher, and that's probably the more hands-on part of your job in a typical year, an equally important job of being the head of school is you sort of are focusing on big picture stuff from my perspective of your job. So one thing I want to know, and this is a little bit of a broad question, so feel free to, you can either speak generally or maybe focus on one specific thing. But when you accepted this job, what were your plans for LFA's future? And do you think that the circumstances of this year have changed your course for what you see the future of LFA to be?
That's a brilliant question. So here's what I saw. When I was at LFA, I saw programming with an enormous amount of potential, but not necessarily fully connected. And I saw a unique school. Nobody's like LFA. There are very few boarding schools in Illinois. The fact that a quarter of our students are international, half boarding, half day, co-ed. I mean, it is a unique place. I love that about it. And then the kids that I met were terrific. But I did something called entry plan. I do not believe that a leader should go into a place and say, here is my grand vision, right? And they must go this way. I think you come in with interests. I think you come in with a sense of a place. But my job was to get to know the school. So I did something called entry plan last year. I interviewed 110 faculty and staff between 30 and 45 minutes each. I spoke to literally everybody. I spoke to some of our Sodexo staff. I spoke to student council. I spoke to prefects. I spoke to some of our affinity leaders. And I really did a lot of work to get to know the school and get a sense of what was on the mind of the academy. And things came up, like school spirit came up as a big thing from everybody, you know? And I asked the same questions of everybody. What brought you to LFA? What keeps you here? What do you love about LFA and would want to see change? And what can we do better? And then the last question often engendered the most interesting comments. And that was, is there anything else you want to share with me? And then that was fascinating to hear people kind of chime in when there wasn't a focused, structured question. And then I came out of that with some real clarity as to what the community felt we need to be thinking about and working on. And some of those things were things like school spirit, but some of those things were the way we kind of make decisions around academics and thinking about our equity work and making sure that we're as inclusive as we can be as a school. Those things emerged, and they started to build out kind of a plan that I started to communicate to my colleagues in January, February of 2020. And then the fifth case of coronavirus made its way to LFA when the brother of one of our community members got COVID, literally the fifth case in all of Illinois. And I think you all remember that from last year, the drama of all that.
Yeah.
And then everything changed in turn. Here's what I'll say, Nick, though. I think the focal point, I haven't forgotten about those conversations. There's still things we have to work on around community, things like school spirit. We're going to look at the one strike policy again. That's something I had talked about doing last year, but we're going to have to probably wait to the fall to really give it the attention and time. So I still, the equity inclusion work became a much bigger deal with, the death of George Floyd. But that was already a part of what I was imagining for the school. With such a diverse school, I recently heard from Ms. Mayakana. She said, just because we're a diverse school doesn't mean that we're inclusive. Diversity does not mean inclusion. And that really resonated with me. All of our students, And it's a bit range. I'm talking about our conservative students too, you know what I'm saying? Students who maybe have a religious background that they feel like they can't share. Obviously, race is a big part of it, gender. And I think there was some work for us to do that was already identified before George Floyd's death, but obviously it brought it to greater focus. So I've been working with a committee that's going to start talking to students actually after the break, called the Head of School Equity Task Force. And it's 16 of my colleagues, and we're working on how to make LFA more equitable and inclusive, and looking at specific things we can do and to hold our school in account and make sure that everyone feels included and heard. And that's been an amazing project. So all those things, Nick, existed beforehand. I got them from Entry Plan. I think when COVID is done, I find that COVID is not something that brings about new problems that a school has. It amplifies and exacerbates already existing challenges. So anything that we're seeing that's a bit of a challenge for us, LFA, is connected somewhat to things that happened pre-COVID. It just gets accelerated. And I'll humbly speak as a leader, it's bringing out my strengths, and it's also bringing out some of my weaknesses. You know, there are things that I can bring to this, and there are things that I'm challenged with, and they're not new things, gentlemen. They're not, right? These are things that already existed that COVID is bringing into greater focus. And just my hope is, and I think LFA has shown this, that our strengths are outpacing our challenges, and I sure hope that that's how I'm being perceived as well. But I say that very humbly because, you know, a pandemic will shake up any foundation. I'm so proud of our school. Our school's done an incredible job.
If what you said is true and that the pandemic is exposing issues we may have already had before, do you think it almost helps by letting them be more visible to figuring out how to get rid of them?
Yeah, I think part of it is that it does bring it to attention to a certain extent. But I also think there's an element of boldness. People speak up more, right? I think sometimes when you're under duress or scared, maybe it's, you know, I'm hearing from people whose voices maybe wouldn't have spoken up in a different context. And that I think is ultimately a good thing, that when voices get heard. And you know, always respectful. I think it's really important to honor people and recognize and think about what their intent is when engaging with someone. But I think sometimes a pandemic will just make you speak up. You know, for me, I know it's made me tell people I love them even more, you know. But it's also helped me realize that there might be people in my life and situations in my life that maybe aren't the healthiest for me, you know, and it's just bringing things into greater focus and clarity. And I think that kind of boldness that comes with this moment is part of it, Nick, is that I think people are speaking up a little bit more and a little bit are more willing to, because the circumstances are such where you just feel a certain sense of urgency. I'm hoping that we learn a ton of lessons from COVID. There'll be a silver lining to this human tragedy, and that LFA will become stronger from it. But it's going to require us, continue to navigate this period well, but also being humble enough to take a step back and say, okay, what can we learn from this moment? And not just think of it as an anomaly, but think of it as something that helped bring things into greater focus.
When comparing the first half of last year, I'm sure you came in with like a plan, something you wanted to accomplish kind of pre-COVID, and then following February or March when COVID hit, what were some of the significant changes to your job at Head of School, and how stressful has it been dealing with all of these challenges that COVID has brought up?
Another great question. Y'all are killing with the questions. You know, it is my number one responsibility at LFA as head of school, and any head of school I think would say this, is first kind of the safety and security of the community. That's paramount. Every single day, your parents give us the gift of letting you come to our school. That's just the bottom line. And being an independent school, it's a real choice, right? So basically, you know, every student that comes through the door, it's a sacred trust, right? And keeping you safe is of paramount importance. And that safety manifests itself in a lot of different ways. It's not just the physical safety, as in getting a virus, but it's also a bit of an emotional safety. And to challenge you, but in a manner where we're not going to cause harm, right? We want to stretch you, challenge you, push you, but we never want to harm you. And we take that very seriously. So that's not a new thing, Rohan, in terms of my job. And the safety of our community is of paramount importance. You know, I don't remember, we did emergency planning beforehand. We did a scenario where everyone had to, you know, remember shelter in place, right? In classrooms, preparing for the possibility and the kind of the nightmare of, let's say, a school shooting situation. So I'm already thinking about health, emergency, and safety constantly. I was already thinking about bringing a director of health services to LFA who can work very closely with Ms. Madeley, because I'm seeing more issues of mental health manifesting themselves in our schools. And how do we do that more programmatically and thoughtfully? So that was not new. However, Rohan, it is a different ballgame when you're sitting there and you're going, can a decision that I make ultimately lead to the harm of a member of my community? And the stakes are just become higher. And it was a very, very stressful thing to undergo. I'm very lucky that I have a great team. I'm very lucky that I had Mr. Dolby last spring, who was an unbelievable associate head, and Mr. Tennyson as assistant head last year, now associate head. Those men I will always care for and love because of the experience that the three of us had navigating these waters. And then, so many members of my team rose, and I didn't feel alone in it, Rohan, which was huge. Yeah. Even though ultimately, and then Mr. Malak as the chair of the board of trustees, the executive committee of the executive committee of the trustees, which is about a dozen people, they've been amazing, and they had my back. When I had to make the decision, Rohan, in March for us to go remote the rest of the year, I believe we were the first school in all of Illinois to make that decision. And it was one, as a first year head, that came with a lot of challenges, and risk. But I felt in that moment that it was the right thing to do for our community. And that decision, Rohan, was a very, very difficult one at the time. A month later, it seems obvious, right? Governor Pritzker ended up, I think within weeks, doing a formal shelter-in-place order and schools were closed. But at the time when I made that decision, Rohan, I was the only one. And being a new head and being new at LFA meant that the stakes just felt really big. But more than that, it was just this overwhelming feeling of responsibility for our community. And trying to make the best decision what was in front of us. Because remember, we didn't know anything. Back then, people were saying that masks might not help, right? Back then, we didn't have a sense of, we started to have a sense of social distancing, but that wasn't even a thing. That wasn't really even a term. There's so much that we learned since then that has helped us. So it was a very stressful period. I was fortunately, Rohan, not alone. And everyone rose to the occasion. The students rocked with me. The parents rocked with me. The community understood. And everyone stepped up. And the result is that I think we had a really good remote period this spring. Imperfect. There were things we could have done better, no question. But we had to almost build a virtual school within a 2-week span. And my team they had no spring break. We had basically no summer. And hopefully we'll get a little bit of a winter break. That's going to be good. But here we are again, close to a shelter-in-place situation in the state. So I'm feeling tired. I'm feeling proud and tired. I think that's how a lot of my colleagues are feeling right now. And you still feel the weight of the responsibility. But I'm really proud that we were able to deliver this for our students. So we were able to have our students be here, as many of them as could be in person. And then we delivered. I'm also proud of the product we gave to a lot of remote students. We had specific classes for many of our students who were particularly in the Far East. That was really important to allow them that kind of contact. And great stories like Ms. Strudwick coming back to teach math virtually is really one of my favorite stories of the pandemic. Seeing her name in the faculty meeting this morning was really cool. And feeling that same dedication and passion she did as a math teacher here. Everyone rose. Everyone rose to the occasion. But Rohan, there are moments of real stress. There are moments of some doubt and worry. And it comes from a real place of love, honestly, and concern of what is best for us.
And you talked about you and your team planning how to open the school, especially since I think everything was sort of unknown about how we would handle in-person schooling up until we began. We're sort of entering into uncharted territories. And even though we are in person, you can still tell it's a very different feel than like the beginning of last year in terms of, how we communicate with each other and just what the student body feels like. So do you think next year students will be able to expect a return to what the beginning of the 2019 to 2020 school year is? Or do you think that this change in normalcy sets the student body on a different path?
I think it's more the former, but not completely. I don't think by next fall we'll be at a place where we're going to be at 2019 level So for example, will we be at a place where we can do an all-school handshake? You know, we may have to wait till later in the year. I don't know. I can't predict. I do feel some enthusiasm. I think the vaccine trials have gone much better. I have learned more about viruses and vaccines and epidemiology than I ever want to know. And I hope I never need to use that information again. But I've been following the vaccine trials since the very beginning, since Moderna first introduced this notion of an mRNA approach to vaccines. And it was a brand new, well, it had been used in different ways before, but never in this kind of scope. So the two vaccines coming from Pfizer and coming from Moderna, the first two, are coming from brand new technology. I'm enthusiastic, Nick, that everyone who want a vaccine will have access to it by this summer. It's also a good sign that the state of Illinois has designated different phases of vaccine deployment. And sorry, y'all, children are kind of towards the end for a good reason, and that is that your outcomes tend to be much better when you get sick. And thank God those students of ours who've gotten sick were generally asymptomatic, and the ones who felt symptoms, none of them were hospitalized, thank God. My biggest worry, that keeps me up at night kind of worry, are my colleagues. They're much more vulnerable. So we were able to do something. We did an exemption process. Some of you might have remote classes right now from teachers who are not in person. And that's because they have either comorbidities that make them a greater risk, or they live with someone who's at higher risk. And we honored them by having them be able to stay home. In the Illinois plan, the K-12 schools, teachers are phase 2. So first it's going to go to the frontline workers, our health workers, which is exactly right. And then it's going to go to some of our nursing homes, people who work in nursing homes and people who work with assisted living facilities, which is exactly right. The vast majority of the deaths from COVID come from people who are over 80 years old and are often in assisted living period. And this, the next 2-3 months, I think people are going to start getting vaccines in these populations. And that is huge. I'm hopeful that by the spring, our colleagues who want to take it will be able to take it. And then by the summer, we'll have enough where students will be able to take it as well, which would allow, Nick, for, I think, a more normal fall 2020 start. I'm also cautiously optimistic that we were able to do something in person and maybe different in May. Like I want to celebrate the seniors as best we can. We've been very creative. We could not do it in the fall and this past spring. We just did not have the knowledge. We just didn't have it. And that was the right decision. But I'm personally going to work really hard to make it so that we can find some way to do this. It's an important moment. And I'm also, again, optimistic that we'll be able to protect a lot of the people who are most vulnerable by that time, and that maybe we can start to really fight back against this awful virus.
Shifting to a lighter note, so as someone who's a history teacher, 2 things. 1, who's one person you'd like to go back in time and meet? And 2, what time period would you like to spend a year in?
Ooh, Abraham Lincoln is a hero of mine. I've read his bio. I read his biography. I read some of his own writings, and one of my favorite books ever. And I recommend it to you, gentlemen, because I know you're all going to be leaders in some way. When I see a really great kind of emerging leader in the past, I've given them this book, Team of Rivals, by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It talks about Lincoln having to lead the nation during the Civil War, and building a team of people who literally were going against him during the campaign. What he was able to do during that period is unbelievable. Apparently the guy was also hilarious, like a good, dry, kind of Midwestern classic sense of humor. And I just think that, I don't know, I've always been in some awe of what he was able to do. He was a congressman only for a few years when he became president. He had lost his Senate bid against Stephen Douglas. He had lost that election before he was elected. And I think his writings to this day hold, in my opinion, as really important. He was imperfect. His views on race were of the time and complicated. But then again, there were things that he actually did to advance some of the dynamics of race in America beyond emancipation that were really important. So I find him to be a complicated, fascinating, and amazing figure that I would love to spend some time with, from the past. I think he comes up first. In terms of a year, oh man, I never thought about this. What an interesting question. Ooh, as an observer or as a participant?
If it's a dangerous place, I say you won't get harmed. So you get full reign without worrying about your safety.
Oh my God. That's one of the most challenging questions I think I've ever gotten.
We ask tough questions on the Spectator Podcast.
I love it. I'm going to be a big fan. I'm going to be subscribing for sure. A couple of years come to mind. I think 1968 was an amazing year. I'm a big music buff. I love music and culture. And that year, there was a lot of turbulence. There was a lot of uprising. But I think the American culture it was an important moment in the culture. And both of the tensions that exist in America that we're still seeing today, even in the election. But the culture itself, opening itself even more to new voices. The music was terrific during that period. And they were just kind of pushing boundaries. So that year comes to mind as a year that would be a really fascinating year. And a year that where in the world, there's so much going on. Now, I would not want to be in Vietnam, right? So that's why I asked about, whether I'd be fully involved. But that would be a really, really interesting year to witness. And for me, the culture of it would be amazing. Even film was starting to grow in some ways. And I'm pretty deep into culture, but particularly music. Being able to go to some of those concerts would be unbelievable. The artists that were performing in that period, to this day are still the best, and then grew into it. I just got my Spotify Wrapped. Did you get that?
Yeah, I will be keeping my top 5 close to my heart.
So the 60s and the 70s are right up there. Although I'm not going to lie, the first one was pop. I'm not going to front. I was a big fan of the Harry Styles and Lana Del Rey album, so that's what I listened to the most. But yeah, the 70s, I think, the 60s and the 70s, late 60s and 70s is definitely, I think, that my top genre, which surprised me. In my Spotify Wrapped. Going to some of those concerts would be, I feel like, life-changing. I've been to some life-changing concerts. I think it would be life-changing to see some of those people and just to see the culture and the nation in that moment.
So for our last question, last year we talked a lot about grilling and advisory. And with a year of grilling under your belt, what's your go-to meat to grill?
Well, actually, it's interesting. Grilling and smoking has become. I used to not, smoke it from a smoker, not smoking as in, things we shouldn't be smoking. But I never had a grill in my life. I'm from New York, y'all. From Puerto Rico when I was 6. I came out when I was 6. I've lived in New York or in Massachusetts. I never even knew how to turn on a grill. Honestly, my little brother was the griller in the family. So my first grill was actually in April. That was another COVID silver lining. We were kind of like, okay, what can we do? It was like, all right, we need to cook more and let's get a grill. So we actually put it together because the grill, no one was putting things together then. So we had to, my wife and I put together. And then I got a smoker, which was a game changer. There is nothing as satisfying and amazing as a good brisket. A beef brisket, a smoked beef brisket. I have a charcoal smoker, so I have to tend the fire. It takes about 9 to 10 hours. I chill out in the back with my dog, Chulo. Occasionally, my kids will come and check on me. Look out to the beautiful Taxi Pond and the birds and just love life and really appreciate kind of everything I have and all the blessings that I have. And when that brisket comes out, it's a hard thing to cook, but you get a beautiful brisket, and to me, there's very little that tastes as good as a good brisket. So now that I see some nodding heads from all of you gentlemen, when things get better, you're going to come through and we're going to have some brisket together. How's that sound?
Hey, if you're cooking, I'm down. I don't think anyone wants me using a grill or eating anything that I've grilled.
Nah, I'm going to get some brisket to all of you. But yeah, that's the one. And I think the challenge makes it so rewarding. And the irony is that my kids are not that into it, and my wife likes it. They kind of like it for once or twice. If I have a brisket in the fridge, that's going to be lunch like every day. I get obsessed. It is really tasty and a lot of fun.
All right. Well, Mr. Jesus, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was a lot of fun. I'm not surprised that you all came up with such good questions, being LFA students. And thank you all for just how amazing you've all been and how our student body has been. Like I said, my heart swells with pride. And you three gentlemen are just amazing examples of everything that is LFA. So thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Mr. Jesus.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Join us next semester when we have even more guests and new episodes. Thank you and goodbye.